The Paris attacks could make things a lot more complicated for Syrian refugees, to say the least. Many are escaping violence and war. Let's turn to Marco Vicenzino in London. He's the director of the Global Strategy Project. Marco, welcome.
Thank you.
So what do you think is going to happen to hundreds of thousands of refugees trying to make their way into Europe with what has happened in Paris now? It certainly sounds like it's going to make things a lot more complicated.
2 days before the actually the day before the actual attack in Paris, there was a summit held in Malta, the Malta summit held between the leaders of the European Union, the President Erdogan of Turkey, and some leaders of some of the African states. Basically, in Europe, you've had, this was a summit dedicated to migration. But the real meeting, the real most important one, the one that of immediate importance, was a meeting between the European leaders and President Erdogan of Turkey. As we know, President Erdogan of Turkey just won an election on November 1st. He stunned everyone, defied the polls. It gives him new leverage, so he's in a position to negotiate. And for the previous 4 years, since everything began in Syria in 2011, you've had, up to now, Turkey hosts roughly 2.5 million Syrian refugees. For a long time, he's been calling for help from Europe, but that help wasn't coming. Now, when we speak about Europe, we're talking about 28 member states. So and a lot of decisions are made up on consensus. So the decision process is not made easy, but due to this year alone, probably 1 million will be arriving in Europe, if not more. So the immediacy, and that was a hastily arranged conference, whereby now it seems like there'll be an accord that will be signed before the end of November, early December, whereby they'll address this issue, whereby the Turks will control the situation a lot more with European aid, and then a process of distribution begins. The difference between now and before is that there was uncontrolled immigration. There needs to be an order, there needs to be a sense of control, and that now the situation, what happened in Paris, will accelerate that process even more.
But the reality, Marco, is what has happened in Paris is making various countries and even states in the United States of America from not wanting to let Syrian refugees into their states or countries. And how do you explain to people what happened in Paris was horrific, but it was the act of few individuals, not an entire population?
Okay. I think your argument that you just spoke about really much applies a lot to the U.S. side, to the U.S. political debate in light of the election coming up. In Europe, throughout in recent months, before, weeks and months before,
I'm talking about after
what happened
Paris.
In Paris, a lot of the states that have refused to take immigrants, most of the states of Central and Eastern Europe, and also to a certain extent the UK, the ones that were taking in Germany, has gradually, there's been brewing a sense that we need some order to this uncontrolled immigration. Now with the Paris attacks, it's raised voice even more. But even before the Paris attacks, the process was already beginning. The Paris attacks may accelerate the debate, but that treaty, if it's signed with Turkey, will still allow Syrian refugees into Europe, but at a much more controlled pace. It's impossible. And many of the states of Central and Eastern Europe, if you look at Greece, places like Italy, these are places that are in crisis, serious economic crisis. States of the Balkans, through which many of these immigrants are passing through, they have their own crisis. Generosity itself also has its limits. So we have to be aware. The reality is that many parts of Europe are serious in crisis. There's a Syrian crisis taking place whereby thousands are fleeing, not only just to Europe, but other parts of if we're looking at parts of Asia itself, and you're looking at some parts of the Middle East. The bulk want to go to Europe because there's more opportunity there.
But what about fears of xenophobia here? Are you concerned at all about that?
The xenophobia has been there there's an element of xenophobia within the European debate that's been there for quite a while. Pegida in Germany, the National Front in France. You have parties in Italy now coming up. You have the UKIP in the UK. And even in the north, if you look at the Scandinavian countries, even in Finland, there's many of you can call, it depends. Someone will call it xenophobic, some will call it center-right. It depends how you define it. Sometimes it's a matter of degree. The Paris attacks, yes, will increase that, but Europe has to make a decision. Either they're going to let the intention of these radicals, of these jihadists, if you want to call them, if that's the term one wants to use, they thrive on polarization and they thrive on division. And one of their goals is to be able to create a wedge. And there is an existing wedge between certain major European countries and some members of citizens of the Muslim faith. Their idea is to separate that gap even wider. And Europe has to make a choice to either let this violence further divide, or they make a conscious effort to unite. And that requires leadership, clear leadership, and President Hollande has demonstrated that leadership, but other leaders of Europe have to do the same thing. The U.S. political debate in terms, that's a separate, the way I look at it, separate from Europe, because the numbers that are going into the U.S. they're calling for is roughly 10,000. And within the grand scope of this entire migration crisis, it's not much. When you have over a million coming into Europe just in less than a year, and 10,000 are going struggling to get into the U.S., that's more for a domestic political debate.